Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this series, we bring in scholars from across the country to present insights from their research and experiences with the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. I'm really excited about our speaker today, Daniel Buck, and this presentation and the one on November 1st are both on the topic of K through 12 education. If you think about increasing opportunity and flourishing, that's one of the best ways we can increase opportunity and flourishing is providing a good education to young people. So I'm excited about Daniel being here today. Daniel Buck is a policy and editorial associate at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a former English teacher and frequent author. His writing has appeared in various national publications, including the Wall Street Journal and National Review, as well as policy and academic journals such as National Affairs and Education Next. His first book, What is Wrong with Our Schools, and some of you got that today, was published through John Catt Educational. I'm really excited again about Daniel being here. Let's all welcome Daniel Buck.
All right, thank you all for having me here today. Thank you for coming out today, and thank you for John for the gracious introduction and the welcome to this speaker series. You all are far larger than the people I usually speak to. I have since accepting this lecture, have taken a role as an assistant principal at a classical charter school. So we open our day every day with an assembly, and I'm used to speaking to kindergartners and first graders who are very excited and squirmy, so the change in audience is a nice change of pace. Also forgive me if at any point I sound a bit hoarse today. I lost my voice earlier this week, and the students have been asking me to do Batman impressions ever since. Again, I changed my job. Why did I do that? And I'm not doing policy work in DC anymore since taking this lecture. I'm now at a charter school, back in the trenches, working with students every single day. And the reason I made that decision is because I so believe in what I'm about to talk about today. I read everything that I was writing about, researching, advocating for, speaking about, and so believed in it that I wanted to become a part of the movement to improve education in America, not just write about improving education in America. So what I'm talking about today isn't something that I just find interesting, but it's something that I deeply, deeply believe in, so much so that it's affected my career and life trajectory. So this is Hillsdale Classical Academy in Hillsdale, Michigan. It is not the school that I teach at, but it is sort of one of the more reputable classical schools in the country. It's the kind of model school that my own looks to for policies, instructional best practices, procedures, communications, curriculum, all of those kinds of things. Teacher-led instruction happens there. Every day opens with a student reciting memorized poetry. They discuss literature in seminars and Socratic discussions. It is old school, it is beautiful, it is wonderful, the learning and education that happens there. How in the world did I get here? When I graduated from teacher college, I thought classical education was old school, anachronistic, ineffective, boring, sleepy, oppressive even, and yet now I'm working at one. I liken my journey into classical education to, I steal this analogy from G.K. Chesterton, who was a lay theologian and a popular author, and he uses the story of a adventurer who, I forget that there's a screen back there, an adventurer who sets sail to discover new lands. But soon after leaving London, he runs into a storm, gets all turned around, has no idea where he is, keeps sailing, lands back on the United Kingdom, and thinks he's discovered somewhere new. And he walks around and he's mapping out the new topography and taking notes on the new plants, and he finally plants a flag for New London, but he's just a few miles outside of Old London, totally lost and confused. And Chesterton uses this analogy, this fun little goofy story, to explain how he found his way into Orthodox Christianity, where he kind of precept by precept deconstructed his atheism and then kind of came to new beliefs one at a time, and then looked around. He thought he had built a new ideological, intellectual framework, but well, he just rediscovered more or less Orthodox Christianity. For me, I deconstructed much of what I believed about education coming out of teacher college and started discovering the effectiveness of, in my own teaching, in my own reading, the effectiveness of practices like regular quizzes, a good, well-planned lecture, structured classrooms, and basic rules fairly enforced, things like these. And little by little by little, I thought I was building a unique philosophy of education, and then I discovered classical education, that there's people that have been doing what I thought was new and interesting and innovative. They've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, because these are the things that are tried and true. They are the habits and practices of teaching children new knowledge that have proven effective over time, again and again and again. So I'll go through a few of these, 3. There's a slide later on where I'll talk about far more in rapid succession, but we'll dig into 3 of them. Direct instruction or explicit instruction is a fancy way of saying an engaging lecture. Sequence curriculum and low-stakes quizzing. So instruction. We all know, of course, that lectures are the most ineffective way to transmit information from speaker to listener, which is why we are all here today in a lecture series. It's why if any of you become teachers or have been teachers or have the misfortune of going to teacher professional development, you will be lectured at why lectures are an ineffective way to teach students. And it's always going to come through lecture, somebody telling you that lectures are awful. It's why religions and politicians and organizations and institutions rely on somebody standing up front and explaining knowledge that they have, information that they have, to somebody that doesn't know it, that's interested in it. This is project follow-through, or a graph of project follow-through. It is the most expensive study of education that the US Department of Education has ever funded. It involved 200,000 some students, dozens of schools, and these schools could choose an educational model that they wanted to try and implement. They could kind of select from a menu. And then they got funding and consultation to make sure they could implement this model to fidelity. And when the dust settled, there's confounding variables, and it was a bit of a messy experiment. But when the dust settled, direct instruction, I know it's kind of hard to see, but that's the outcomes of direct instruction, was far away the winner. When researchers tracked outcomes, achievement, all these kinds of things, direct instruction just blew every single other model out of the water. And direct instruction doesn't have to be, we all think of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the teacher standing up front, Bueller, drawling on, everyone's falling asleep, anyone, no one answers a question, somebody drops their pencil because they finally did fall asleep and now they're snoring. That doesn't have to be what direct instruction is. If you go into a classroom like the Hillsdale Academy, I was there just the other week, teachers aren't up front talking for 50 straight minutes while the students sit there and fall asleep. There's call and response. They are modeling, they're showing examples, they're spinning interesting stories and anecdotes. The students are giving choral responses to questions that are regularly asked about grammar or math or whatever it is. There's an example problem, students do it, we check it. peppering students with questions all the time, perhaps breaking out into small groups to try something. Direct instruction doesn't have to be just straight lecture for 50 minutes, but it is teacher guided, it is teacher directed, it does rely on a teacher up front explaining new concepts. You'll notice about the outcomes, the dark blue is basic academics. Critics of direct instruction will often acknowledge that it's really good for teaching the basics. Phonics, your multiplication tables, basic facts about history or science, but what about higher order thinking skills, critical thinking, problem solving? Well, that's the blue graph is higher order thinking skills, problem solving skills in particular, and then the red bar is self-esteem. Kids tend to feel pretty good about themselves when they're doing well in school and when they're learning their academics well and can read well and do their math well and aren't set problems that make them feel bad about themselves because they have no idea how to do it. Direct instruction achieves these sort of more affective goals along with just the basics of academics. Moreover, long-term follow-up found that the students who went through the direct instruction model were more likely to apply for and attend college, more likely to graduate from high school. They had higher reading and math scores going into high school. So again, critics of direct instruction will often say, it's good for learning up until the test or up until that standardized assessment, but then you forget it all. But that's not the case when people look into it. There's long-term learning that happens. Another experiment involved this little contraption here. The researchers wanted to teach students about the concept of single variable experiments. So they gave them this little contraption. You can change the surface that a ball rolls down, the type of ball, so how heavy it is, how steep the ramp is and how long the ramp is, and then you change one variable and it changes how far up the other side the ball will roll. And they split these students into two groups. The first group got direct instruction. The teacher stood up front with the model in front of them and said, we're going to do some, you're going to take some notes, here are these questions that you have to answer as I talk about it, and explain the concept directly to the kids of single variable experiments. And then the other group got the contraption and a bunch of guiding questions, and they had to discover their way into this knowledge. Perhaps from my slightly biased explanation of the experiment, it should probably surprise no one that the students that got the direct instruction, far more of them on follow-up assessments demonstrated that they had understood this concept. More kids understood single variable experimentation, controlling your variables, when a teacher said, this is what it means, take some notes, I'm going to show you some examples, take some notes on that, and just explained it to them, versus here's the contraption, here are the questions, good luck. Interestingly, the researchers then had these students go to a science fair to analyze just student posters for this concept that they had just learned. Controlling your variables in experiments, single variables. Because they wanted to see, well, maybe more kids understood the concept and could kind of repeat the definitions that they were given or answer a few multiple choice questions, but can they apply it in different contexts? Perhaps if you discover your way there, you're going to have a deeper understanding that can apply across contexts. Didn't really matter which way they learned this concept. If they showed mastery of the concept, either from having it explained to them or from discovering it themselves, they could critique these posters fluently and judiciously. The only thing that differed was in the first group, more students showed mastery. In the direct instruction group, more students showed that they had learned this concept than the discovery group. It didn't matter, how they learned it didn't affect their ability to apply it in different contexts. It didn't mean they had a deeper understanding or anything like that. There are far more experiments like this one. I think you all got a copy of my book. So if you're interested in more, you can look in there. But let's wrap this one up and then we'll move on to the next one. So the teacher is the text from which students will learn. I really value direct instruction because I value the role of the teacher in the classroom. The teacher's the content expert. They know the science, they know the history, they know the math, they know the literature, the grammar, the art, the music, whatever it is. They know the content. And it is their role, their job, a wonderful job, an important profession, to explain these concepts to kids and make sure they get it. All new knowledge that we're going to learn comes from outside of ourselves. I can't construct ex nihilo new information in my brain that I haven't learned anywhere. On the fringes of human understanding, we have to rely on experimentation and discovery in scientific labs. But that is an incredibly expensive and inefficient process, learning brand new information for the entirety of the human species. For everything that we've already learned, we have a very powerful tool at our hands to transmit knowledge from one person to another: language. I can explain things. We already know how to do long division. Somebody else figured that out, so now we can use language to explain that to students. And we can talk it to them. We can watch YouTube videos, we can read books about it, but YouTube videos, books, whatever the newest software is that they're trying to sell our schools for hundreds of thousands of dollars, that can't talk back to students. If a student is confused, a teacher can give another example, can try another analogy, can start from scratch, give a different activity. A teacher can watch the room and see the kids are falling asleep. I need to have them stand up and do some jumping jacks. A teacher can scan the room, and if anyone here is a teacher or an administrator, you know that look of a classroom where every single student, you're like, they are not tracking me at all right now. We're going to cut this off and try again tomorrow and do something else because this just isn't working. Teachers can do that. Books can't. YouTube videos can't. They can't respond to the audience. So the teacher is the best text from which students should learn new information. All right, curriculum. Let's start this little mini section with the test of your reading comprehension. I'm going to take a second, I'm going to pause, give you a sec to read this paragraph and be thinking, could I answer comprehension questions about it, or could I, after the fact, sequence in order what step 1, step 2, step 3 is? You probably haven't finished. That's okay. You get the sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense. 2 groups were given this paragraph. One group scored wonderfully. After the fact, they could sequence it almost perfectly. They scored just about 100%. And the other group, unsurprisingly, got about 0%. The group that did well had one important piece of information. It's about laundry. You read it again, the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups depending on their makeup. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. All of a sudden, this paragraph makes a lot of sense. And the researchers created this little demonstration to show readers what it's like to read a text, either that you don't know anything about, or if you're a young student that just doesn't know a lot about the world. Another way we could demonstrate this, I don't have an example here, but if you're showing up to a university lecture at 10:19 on a Friday morning, you probably fancy yourself a pretty strong reader. I think that's a safe assumption that I could make. But if I gave anyone, just about anyone, in this room an article about the sport cricket, written at the 6th grade reading level, all of a sudden that article is going to be incomprehensible to you, not because you're a weak reader necessarily, but you just don't know a single thing about the sport cricket. You don't know what a sticky wicket is, what a run chase is, you don't know the rules of the game, you don't know what the field looks like, who the teams are, even what countries probably all play cricket and partake in international competitions. You don't know anything about cricket, so you can't understand that reading about cricket, not because you're a bad reader, you just don't know anything, and that's fine. The point I'm trying to make here is that our ability to do even basic academic or intellectual tasks, something as simple, complex, as reading, relies on a wealth of knowledge about the world. Another pretty ingenious little study. It's kind of a seminal landmark study in education. If you're in education, you're probably sick of hearing about the baseball study. If you're not, it's an interesting one. They got a group of students, and they measured their reading ability and their knowledge of the game baseball. And then they gave these students a reading about baseball. And they had the students move around figures on a little model baseball field to see how well they understood the text. And what mattered on this little test of comprehension wasn't their supposed reading ability, but how much they knew about the game. So so-called poor readers who knew a lot about baseball outperformed the good readers who didn't know anything about the game. Again, it doesn't matter if you can decode the word third baseman or home run. If you don't know what those words mean, that text is going to mean nothing to you. Our ability to read, let alone think critically or create creatively, depends on our knowledge of a topic and the world more broadly. Other examples. A student could decode the word Berlin Wall. Let's say they're reading a column by Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal. Apologies to any New York Times or Washington Post subscribers out there, but I have my preferences. So they come across the word Berlin Wall in a newspaper article. They might be able to sound it out, but for them to understand the point that the author's trying to make, they have to know, what is the Berlin Wall? When was the Berlin Wall built? When was it torn down? Why was it torn down? Why were people fleeing from one side to the other side? What were the political theories, general political theory, that caused the kinds of societies that would lead people to flee from one side to the other? What in the world was the Cold War? Who were the world leaders at the time? What were the politics like at the time? To read well, we have to have a whole lot of knowledge about this world. Even to read a basic newspaper column, we have to know a lot about history, science, literature, all these kinds of things. You might come across, oh, he's such a Romeo. Well, if you don't know what Romeo and Juliet is, that sentence is incomprehensible to you. To create the kind of educated citizens who can think creatively, who can solve problems, who can comprehend the news of the day, we have to thoughtfully and sequentially expose them to new knowledge through a planned out curriculum. E.D. Hirsch is a professor emeritus who created a curriculum built on this theory that our academic achievement depends not so much on academic skills, these abstract concepts like critical thinking, reading comprehension, but just on our knowledge of the world. You have to build knowledge in the brains and the minds of students, not necessarily train academic skills. So he built a curriculum kind of based on this theory, and there's a landmark study just last year, involved 2,300 students, tracked students that applied at a core knowledge school, one of the schools, any school that used his curriculum built on this knowledge theory of learning and thinking. So they tracked students who applied and then either got in or didn't get in. And the gains that the students made at this school, the ones who attended core knowledge school compared to those who applied but didn't get in, their learning gains, if these were scaled across the United States, it would place the US in the top 5 in the world. And one core knowledge school eliminated the socioeconomic achievement gaps, which has been the holy grail of education reform for decades, and this school is doing it through a well thought out, planned, rigorous curriculum. Last one of my mini 3, I'll do this one a bit more quickly, quizzes. This is the Ebbinghaus-Vigeting curve, theorized by Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885. Check my dates if you care to. I might be wrong there. The numbers always change, but the general concept applies and is true. We forget things. Big if true. I know that's going to be news to everyone in this room that we forget things. If you go up to lunch after this, you might be able to discuss a few of the studies that I talked about. A month from now, you might remember my general thesis that I'm trying to put forward here, that old school education works and innovation is sometimes an misplaced ideal in education. You might be able to remember kind of some of the main points I make. A year from now, 10 years from now, you might forget that you even came to this lecture until somebody tells you about, like, oh yeah, I did go to that thing. The guy had a yellow tie on, I think. We forget things over time. How in the world do we keep ourselves from forgetting things? Quizzing, forcing ourselves to recall knowledge, is a very effective way to remember things long term. Note to students out there, quiz yourself. It's rereading your notes isn't necessarily the best way to do it. Hand your notes to a friend and have them ask you questions. Forcing yourself to recall the information that you learned is going to help you remember it better than just reading your notes over and over and over and over and over again. I liken it to a piece of paper that you stick up on a bulletin board. The first time you encounter information, it's like you put it up on a bulletin board. You encode it in your long-term memory the first time. But if that's all you do, and you take your hand away and you go away from the content, you're going to forget it and it's not going to stick in your memory. But every time you quiz yourself on that and force yourself to try and recall that information, pull it back, retrieval is what it's called, retrieve that information from long-term memory. It's like another staple in that bulletin board every time you do it, and it makes it more likely that it's going to stay there long-term. We all forget things, that's natural, but regular low-stakes quizzing, spaced practice, these are the kinds of things that make it more likely that you'll remember it and kind of curves that forgetting curve in a better direction. And this applies to so many things in education. Handwritten notes. I'm glad to see that many of you are doing handwritten notes in here. When you're typing your notes, you can do it so quickly, you can almost write down by dictation, word for word, kind of what a speaker is saying, but it happens so quickly that you forget it. It goes in one ear and out the other. I'll get to working memory in a later slide, but your working memory is the place where you think. Everything that you want to learn to go into long-term memory has to go through your working memory. But when you're typing, it happens so quickly, it doesn't really stay in your working memory. You do it without thinking, and so you never learn it. Handwriting notes is a slower process, which forces you to think about what you're writing. It forces you to listen to a bit of information, synthesize it in your head, and then write it down. So all that information spends more time in your working memory, you're more likely to learn it and encode it in your long-term memory. Paper versus screen reading. Screens have so many distractions on them, so many other tabs, so many messages coming in that we can't really fully attend to what we're reading. Again, our working memory, our place of conscious thought, is so riddled with other tabs, messages, things that you're thinking about, the email that just came in, that you can't attend to what you're reading. You're less likely to learn it. And also, paper and books give us a physical, tactile memory of that information. So this is a random factoid about myself. I still remember in college reading The Fellowship of the Ring, and there's a passage in it where the hobbits, they're walking through kind of a scary wood, and they come out to a river. And it's a beautiful river, it's fall times, the leaves are changing colors. There's willow trees all around the river, a big, strong wind blows, and there's just kind of this tornado of falling willow leaves all around them. And I remember that passage. I thought, man, that's some beautiful descriptive writing. And I also remember it's about a third of the way into the book on the top left of a page. Why do I remember that? I don't know. But I'm sure you guys have books where you kind of remember where in the book this event happens. Not the exact page, maybe not the exact words, but you have some tactile physical memory. Or if you've printed off articles before, you might not remember exactly what page this or that quote is on, but you can find it pretty quickly because you have a general sense of where it is. We have multiple touch points when we have paper versus screen to help us remember this information. Behavior structures, explicit grammar instruction, worked examples, which is just giving kids the answers. If you're going to teach them a new mathematical concept or scientific equations, or I was an English teacher by trade, if I was going to have my students write a paragraph, I would give them a paragraph and say, do it like I did. You haven't done this before, that's fine. You learn by watching experts the first time. So here's an example. Use the words that I use. See the structure that I used and copy that. When you're older and you get this down, do what you want, man. That's great, you've mastered it. But this first time, it's okay to use a model. We learn through mimicry. My own daughter, she's 3.5. I was struggling to get her to learn how to brush her teeth. She couldn't figure it out. And I know this is like a dumb dad thing, but finally I was like, I'm going to bring up my toothbrush and brush my teeth with her. And then all of a sudden, I didn't have to tell her to do this. She looked at me so intently. It's like, what is he doing? And just studied my face for a few minutes. It's like, I'm kind of feeling weird how closely and intently she was watching my face. And all of a sudden, she takes her toothbrush and starts trying to do exactly what I did. We learn through mimicry. So giving kids examples of what you want to do and explaining the examples to them and letting them almost, not word for word copy them, but do it exactly like I did it the first few times. We learn through mimicry. Memorization, I had my students memorize poems every year. They loved it. Now at this school that I'm at, classes have to memorize poems 4 times a year and recite them for assembly. And gosh, what a great way to start the morning it is. And even something as formulaic as like bells in discrete classes. A 15-minute class with a content expert, 45 minutes, provides enough time for this teacher to explain something, give the kids time to practice it without them trailing off into boredom, and then they have a few minutes break to go to the bathroom, refresh themselves, whatever it is, talk to a friend, and then they can go back and refocus. Bells allow for a timely, efficient transition in schools. I've been in schools that don't have bells before, and it doesn't always work really well when one class lets out and another one doesn't, but this class is still going, and the kids are all there waiting, and then it turns to chaos in the hallway, because if you leave third graders with nothing to do, they're gonna find something to do, and it's not what you want them to do. All of this has a purpose. I liken a lot of these. I'm going to go back to Chesterton. He has a little thought experiment called Chesterton's fence. It goes like this. If you buy a new property and there's a fence there, a farm, don't tear down the fence until you know why somebody put it up in the first place. Because just because you don't know why that fence is there, and maybe you don't like that fence, you tear it down, and perhaps winter comes around, and you have snow drifts blocking your windows or doors. Or you're going to have, wolves on your property getting into the sheep. All of these have a purpose, and it's great to question them, but if we try to question them all, interrogate them all, get rid of them all, just because that's the way it's always been done, and we don't want to do it the way that's always been done, we might find out that we've swept away everything of value when we have snowdrifts up against our wall, or our doors, and wolves in the sheep's pen. So why? Why does all of this old stuff still work? And I would argue it's because, technology has changed. Human society has progressed, but human nature and our cognitive architecture in particular hasn't. A long-term memory, working memory, and cognitive load. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, our working memory is our place of conscious thought. It is very active, but it is very limited. We can only think about and remember about 4 to 7 things at a time, depending on who we're talking about and who's counting. It's why phone numbers are only 7 digits long, because if you can remember 7 digits pretty easily if you repeat it to yourself, but if it gets longer than that, you simply can't do it. Our working memory is limited. It's like a doorway into our long-term memory, so it's like a doorway into a giant warehouse. Just unlimited space in our long-term memory. But to get in there is this little tiny doorway, and it gets clogged. If myself, John, and a few of the students all trying to get in at the same time, we're going to clog that doorway and nothing's going to get through. We've all kind of experienced this where there's so many things going on at one time, you can't actually focus on what you're doing. Or you got a stressful email or message, and now all of a sudden you can't pay attention to the lecture because you're thinking about something else. Your working memory is clogged. It's called cognitive overload. And the good and great thing about teacher-led instruction is they can kind of control all of that clutter that can get into your working memory. They can make sure the classroom is orderly and kids are focused and learning and not shooting spitballs or competing to make farting noises in the back of the room. So kids can attend to the content because they're in an orderly, safe, well-structured environment. They can pace things well. They can feed students just enough new information that it poses a challenge to them that they're going to learn, but it's not so many new things going on all at once that it overloads their memory. I've run projects in my classes before where after the fact, the students learned a whole lot about how to add animations to their PowerPoint slides, but they didn't remember a single thing about the content because they were so focused on the technology that they weren't actually attending at all to the content I was hoping they would learn through this project. Same thing with curriculum. It can be paced and sequenced well, so students are neither getting too little of a challenge where it's just easy and they're not learning anything, or such a challenge that it's overloading their working memory and they're not learning anything. Automaticity is just you learn something so well that it becomes automatic and it functionally doesn't take up space in your long-term or in your working memory. So math facts is kind of the prime example of this, where I've had a number of students who struggle through algebra or geometry, not because they can't really understand algebra or geometry, but they're sitting there counting out their math facts on their fingers still, and don't get me started on fractions or negative integers. Primary versus secondary learning, a few other concepts. Primary learning, evolution has primed us to learn a few things seemingly without effort. Spoken language, note, not written language, just spoken language. No one learns written language just by surrounding themselves with books. You have to be taught that. But kids pick up language, spoken language, seemingly without effort. Gross motor movements, basic physics, what goes up must come down. These basic physics, we learn without having to be taught them. This is primary learning. Secondary learning is everything else. Everything that kind of happened post-evolution, we could say. Everything about that we know about music, science, art, history, everything that we learn in school that humanity has discovered, that's all secondary learning. That doesn't come naturally to us. That takes a bit of effort. That takes direct instruction. We can't we could rediscover our way into all of that knowledge, but it took us 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years to discover all of that knowledge. Let's do it in a more efficient way and just explain it to the next generation. There's no shortage of articles right now arguing that everything in education must change. In particular, it was 2 years ago that ChatGPT came around, and it seemed like every legacy publication had someone saying, well, because we have large language models now, everything about education must change. It's kind of an old argument. This is Ken Jennings. There was a documentary made about him a few years ago called Most Likely to Succeed, and he won Jeopardy 74 times, more than anybody else, until he lost Jeopardy. That is the extent of my Photoshop skills. If you want anything else, I can't do anything more. He went against Watson, which is kind of this precursor to large language models and ChatGPT. ChatGPT, I'm sure most of you know, is trained more or less on the entirety of the internet. Watson was trained on Britannica, the archives in the New York Times, and a whole bunch of giant databases, but that's still small compared to all of the internet. But even so, Watson demolished Ken Jennings in Jeopardy. And this documentary made the argument, because Watson, and because we have computers, and we can look up information, we need to just do away with things like classrooms, like lectures, like flashcards, like explanations, like quizzes and tests and all of these kinds of things. Well, that argument is also pretty old. This is John Dewey, far more mustache than Ken Jennings. That this revolution should not affect education in some other than a formal and superficial fashion is inconceivable. He was writing in 1899 about the Industrial Revolution, suggesting that because we now have steam engines and powers and electricity and all of these kinds of things, everything about education must change. This idea that everything in education must change is a pretty old, dusty idea. Let's apply it in other contexts. Healthcare technology and society has advanced so far forward. We must reconsider everything that we do to maintain our healthy bodies, such as washing our hands, regular exercise, or eating healthy. Right? These are habits that kind of transcend time, that are good for us, even if technology has changed. Technology has changed, humanity has advanced, and so we must do away with these outdated child-rearing practices, such as family dinners or reading to our children before bed. These things have value. If we interrogate all of these things and do away with tried and true methods of instruction and education, we will do away with many things that are worthwhile, valuable, effective, good, true, and beautiful. So where's the innovation? I do think there's innovation going on in education right now. I'm a little bit biased. Again, I went to go work at a classical school because I believe in it. I think it's happening in classical education right now. Classical education used to be, it was considered the realm of the privilege of the aristocratic few, those who could afford a tuition of $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Getting an education that teaches children that there are true things about this world that we want them to know, that there's good and right behavior, and it's incumbent upon us to train and teach children about right and wrong, good and evil, that there's beautiful, wonderful works of literature and art and music that we should expose to children. With the charter school movement, we can now scale up this education for everyone. It doesn't have to be just for the hoity-toity affluent, but we believe every single person deserves access to this kind of education, to this rigorous content, this beautiful works of art, this teacher-led, effective, wonderful instruction. If you've ever seen an effective teacher work in the classroom, it is a sight to behold. It's like watching a ballet dancer, a gymnast, a professional athlete running down the field. Their ability to run the classroom is truly a sight to behold. But I think looking back to what has worked before and scaling it up so that every single student in this country has access to it, that is an innovative idea. 42 minutes. Yes.
Great presentation.
So I'm going to grab that concept of critical thinking there, and how do we teach somebody to think critically? There's a cognitive scientist, John Sweller. I wish I had the quote right in front of me, but he's made the argument, and I think persuasively, that there is no such thing as a general concept of critical thinking. So John Dewey gives an example. He tries to lay out what critical thinking is. And he gives the example of a man who's walking down the street. He notices it's gotten a little bit cold. It's gotten a little bit windier. He looks up. There's dark clouds in the distance. And he comes to the conclusion that, well, the weather's going to change. It might be nice and sunny right now, but a storm is coming. And if that's all that critical thinking is, I mean, my dog thinks critically then. She hears a scary noise, runs up to the stoop, looks around, is everything okay? And concludes either I need to go inside and hide, or I can go out and keep chasing the squirrels, whatever it is. John Dewey says that critical thinking is doubting, seeking out new information, and coming to a conclusion. We are all humans. We think critically by nature. What makes that process critical thinking, stacking terms now, but what makes it effective, what makes it more than just basic thinking, is the application of knowledge. I'm going to keep using examples from my classroom because that's my experience. If you wanted to have students think critically about, say, an impeachment hearing, I could say, all right, let's think critically about it. Maybe they can ask a lot of good questions, but they're going to ask better questions. They're going to be able to think more about it if we, say, read a few of the Federalist Papers that kind of talked about what was the purpose of the impeachment process. If we looked at examples of former impeachments and how they went, if we knew the actual facts on the ground of what was happening, if we read the Constitution and understood what the role was or what high crimes and misdemeanors actually meant, to think critically about a topic, you have to know a lot about that topic. It's not some abstract skill that we can train. An engineer can think very critically about bridge mechanics because they know a lot about physics, they know a lot about bridge mechanics, they've designed a lot of bridges. But if you put them in a roundtable discussion about the minutia of healthcare policy, they're not going to be able to think critically about that topic because they don't know anything about it. So I'm not saying direct instruction is sufficient, but it is the way you're going to get the students that you have all of the knowledge about finance that they need about how all of these systems work so they can then go into the profession and kind of advance beyond what we already know and think creatively and solve new problems and all that kind of stuff.
So before I was a professor, I was a K-12 instructor. I've been through teaching training. I've been a teacher trainer, actually. And I don't know anyone who would disagree with you about the tenets of effective teaching. Everyone at structure, quizzes, scaffold, like all that's just like the basics of effective pedagogy. So I'm not entirely sure what you're arguing with. Is there evidence that there are, and certainly there are bad teachers who don't implement this stuff well, right? But are there districts, or is there evidence that public schools as a whole have abandoned the only sort of evidence-based teaching? I mean,
Yes. So the question, I need to remember to respond, say the questions so those online can hear them. The question was, is there evidence, like it seems like you're arguing against no one, like everyone agrees with this, right? If only it were so. I mean, California just passed a new mathematics curriculum and framework that de-emphasizes everything here and is moving towards discovery learning. Teachers shouldn't be explaining these math concepts to kids, but letting them discover their ways there. There's a best-selling math book out there where the author says we need to basically do away with everything that we have ever been doing. When I was in teacher prep, I was told to never talk in front of a class for more than 5 minutes at a time. I would say, from my experience, this is entirely anathema to everything that I had heard, everything that I learned in teacher prep.
I mean, yeah, you shouldn't teach directly for more than 5 minutes per grade. That's why we have longer lectures. You know, that you do 5 minutes and then you do practice or whatever for the little ones. But yeah, this is the basics of the teacher training I delivered 10, 12 years ago.
Well, I'm glad that you deliver it, but there are curricular reviews out there too that show this is not what students are encountering at kind of some of the flagship teacher prep programs out there. They're hearing exactly opposite of this.
Actually, right here in Fargo and West Fargo, education has started to have self-directed education for students. And they're doing that right now as new programs. Where they're, in general, they're self-directed. And even when they're young, they're starting out with this. And I look at that and I'm thinking, this is going to slow down the education process, because how can you teach yourself? Now, there are teachers there. The whole thing is that let the student go at their own pace, let them say they're ready for the next subject. You'll find this happening right here, right now.
Did you have a question?
Sorry, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm an assistant professor here in management, and I'm a master's in linguistics, but specifically teaching English as a foreign language. I'm very familiar with the concepts, I'm sure, and I completely agree with you. Now, in terms of critical thinking, are you saying that critical thinking is context dependent? Because I would think that, as you quoted when you say that you have to doubt. But I think in today's sort of world, or at least in the United States versus other places that I've been, doubting involves risking being offensive, or at least it never used to be, being offensive, but it's just, I think that, do you think that's one of the reasons why critical thinking has sort of, decreased in terms of that, and other things that, I think it all comes down to discipline.
Mm-hmm.
For me, when I was a kid, I didn't want to study. Even my 7-year-old son, he can play a game for 2 hours. He can watch a movie for 2 hours, but he won't sit down and do math for 10 minutes. And my wife is here; she can attest to that. And we have to sit with him and think. But it's just, I think that less and less individuals are doing that in terms of instilling discipline, because if you have discipline, you can do anything, whether you like it or not, and because you know that there's an end result to it.
Yeah.
Just if you can speak to that.
Yeah, so on the role of doubt in critical thinking in that kind of the Dewey's three-step process, yes, I agree. But I'm going to keep coming back to the fact of knowledge, like even to doubt well, beyond mere cynicism, you then have to go out and learn things. You know, the best doubters, critics of the Christian faith know, or any faith, know that faith through and through as well. Right? If you're going to be more than just a cynic, more than you don't believe anything, you have to know about something about that which you want to doubt. And then the other one for the role of discipline, yes, I agree. Great. Next question. I mean, if you want me to speak more to it, my reputation is actually mostly is talking about student discipline and the benefits of student discipline. Kids, learning is inherently effortful. There are times where it will be naturally joyous, and every kid is going to be so intrinsically motivated that they don't talk out of turn or shoot spitballs just out of their own intrinsic motivation. But if you've ever interacted with a 6-year-old, that's most of the time not the case. It takes structure, it takes order, it takes direction, it takes accountability. These aren't bad words, these aren't dirty words. Healthy authority in the classroom, healthy discipline in the classroom. These are good things for children. Boundaries where they know what to do, when to do it. It makes them feel safe. So, yeah. How do we do that in the classroom? In the school or classroom at home is a much bigger conversation than one lecture on a Friday morning. But
So I have a quick question. So there's a teacher shortage task force for the state of North Dakota for K through 12 teacher shortages. And one of the things that has shown up is that, teachers are quitting the profession. So have you seen any studies that looked at the classical schools, and are teachers more satisfied teaching at those schools, or do they retain teachers more than other schools? Not traditional, but other schools, I guess. Have you seen any research on that or anything?
yeah, I will start by saying I have yet to be convinced that there is quite the teacher shortage that people are talking about. Many of the open positions were created with, the glut of ESSER funds. So there's all of these unfilled positions that just didn't exist 5 years ago. And teacher turnover. So yeah, that, to your question about classical education and turnover, surveys of teachers regularly find that their biggest concern is student behavior. That's the thing that's pushing teachers out of the classroom. If you look even at, union surveys, teachers rank discipline, behavior, workload over and above teacher pay as a concern. And I mean, many teachers choose to work at charter or private schools at a cost to their pay. Charter school and private school teachers are paid far less than public school teachers because it is worth the orderly schools, it is worth the good curriculum that gives them things to do, so they're not having to go home every single night and work for 5 hours trying to create their lessons from scratch and figure out what the heck am I going to do tomorrow. So I don't know of any surveys off the top of my head. I know the surveys that show what teachers are actually dissatisfied about, and I know what a lot of charter schools provide, but if that improves turnover, I cannot answer that question with fidelity, knowing that I'm not just speaking misinformation into the air. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, I think what you just mentioned, I agree with you on that, but I'm going to push back on the kind of technology. It seems like you're anti-AI education, you don't need to change what we are doing right now. I think why can't we do what we're doing right now, at the same time have students access to those new technologies? What I'm afraid of, I'm afraid there will be an inequality in access to education when you have students who have access to AI and people who doesn't have access to it?
I think the big divide in a few years, this is just pure projection and prediction. I think the big divide is that we're going to start to see affluent schools going no technology, and then we're going to see impoverished schools and public schools sticking students in front of computers and putting them on the software because it's easy and cheap. So I think that's where the divide is actually going to come in. It's going to be the exact opposite.
But I want to push that because when you go out for a job, on the job market, right now every firm asking you whether you have like a prompt engineer skill. If your student never use AI, how do they even have those skills on their CV? And how do they be even competitive on the job market?
We could have an AI class, and also I will go full in for AI when I see the evidence that it works. One-to-one computing, it was the big promise, everything's going to change, and it didn't. People even thought that erasable pencils were going to be the big thing because all of a sudden students wouldn't have to write for fear of being wrong, but could express themselves and make errors and erase it. Like there's always this new technology and this new promise, and everyone spends millions of dollars on it, and then nothing. So I will be convinced when I'm convinced.
So actually in school, according to your prediction, they did tell students not to use laptop, not use calculator. You all went out to use pencil and book. No laptop.
The Wi-Fi went down at our school the other day, and it wasn't a problem because not a single student was using a computer all day.
Two good points. I think there's a real difference between grade school education and college education. The use of AI, huge difference because of what they've already learned. And to your comment about the people who can afford or buy a degree of technology, they're already doing that. In California, a lot of the big tech firms, their executives, their founders, are already sending their students to schools where they don't allow calculators, for instance, because they want them to learn basic skills.
What would be your perspective on Montessori methods and principles, practices?
I don't know enough about Montessori to love or hate them. There's a fellow that I really deeply respect who's a big fan of Montessori, so I bought some Montessori books and have yet to investigate them. Open-minded to them, especially at younger ages. Much of what I'm talking about here is kind of with older students when you're getting past the primary learning phases, the basics, and you're getting into content knowledge and things. Again, there's spoken language, gross motor movements, all of those kinds of things. That comes through play. It's everything after that we have to learn through study and effort and practice.
Okay, this is a good time to quit, and so thanks for a great presentation.